BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Hello and welcome to the BlomCast, a podcast in which I, Philip Blom, look at turning points in history. Today I want to look at what's perhaps the daddy of them all, the biggest turning point you can imagine. And this is a turning point that had nothing to do with climate change, though in the long run it would produce climate change. The turning point I want to talk about is the curious idea that human beings can rule over nature, that they control nature and that they dominate it. And this is a very old idea. Yes, it goes back to the Bible and the idea of subduing the earth. But as we'll see, it actually goes back a long time further. It is not a biblical idea. The Bible itself took it over from elsewhere. But before we plunge into that, let's just take a step back and let's just see what the world was like before this idea came into the world. How did other cultures conceive of the relation between human beings and nature? Who did they think they were? And what did they think they were in the great scheme of things? Now here you have to be very, very careful when you make statements, because we know so little about past cultures, especially cultures that weren't written down, oral cultures. They came and went. Sometimes they stayed for millennia and vanished without a trace. I was once reminded of that when I was in a museum in Bogota, in Colombia. And I was shown by the guide a piece of wall and a vase. And I said, "Oh, that looks interesting. What's that?" And she said, "Well, we don't know. We found this somewhere in Colombia, and these are the only two things this culture left us. We don't know which language they spoke, which gods they venerated, which technologies they had, apart from obviously pottery and masonry. We knew nothing about them." And that reminded me very powerfully of the fact that if we talk about the distant past, the prehistoric past, there's so little we can know, because most of the richness of human culture has really gone without a trace. But still, we can know something, and we can know that how people thought of themselves and their relationship with nature has always been dramatically different. There are different cultures, such as the Chinese thinking tradition, which knows the idea of the Tao, the way, and the way is how nature works, and human beings simply have to follow it because it is the all-powerful way. But there are also very different ideas. There are, for instance, the Aztecs, who thought that they were the slaves of brutal and incompetent gods who had done such a bad job at creating the world that now they had to be pacified with regular and very bloody offerings. Or the Jivaro in Ecuador, who know that they are at war with nature and that they have to take from nature, to rob from nature whatever they can. But then again, there are completely divergent conceptions of nature. Think of the Maori in New Zealand and the idea of the tapu, a sacred realm that may not be entered. Or the dreamlines of the Australian Aborigines. Think of the turtle identification with nature in Shinto Japan, or of Siberian shamans, or indeed of the sun in the Kalahari in Southern Africa, who know that the ancestors live in the rocks and even in the wind. So these conceptions are so different, And yet they all have something in common. They all have in common with, by the way, the religions of classical antiquity as we know them, that people know that the world isn't empty, that the world is full of gods and goddesses and nymphs and demons and ancestors and different spirits, and that whatever you do in life, you are in a reciprocal relationship with that, in a relationship of giving and taking. So if you want to venture on a sea voyage, you have to make an offering of Poseidon, because after all, you're entering his territory and you're impinging on his sovereignty. So you need to find an arrangement with him. If you want to plow a field, you need to pour out a libation to the local spirits so that they'll be pacified. And of course, these are symbolic acts, but they're symbolic recognitions that what we do is not without consequence. What we do is always changing the world in some way, and therefore impinging on perhaps another force, another interest, another presence. And that we need to reckon with that as human beings, because otherwise these forces in the shape of furies or spirits or demons will be after us and will punish us. We are not alone on earth. And that is something that all animist religions have in common. And perhaps when you realize, when you really conceptualize that, can you really feel the weight of what's to come, or the explosive force of what's to come, because what's to come is a real mythological atom bomb. And that is the idea that human beings are the only really important being on this planet, and that they can subjugate the earth and rule over it. This idea is most famously expressed in the Bible, in the first book of Genesis, and verse 28, in the lovely English of the King James Bible, that sounds as follows. God has just created Adam and Eve, and he is talking to them, and he says, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." So Adam and Eve, on the day of their creation, are made boss of the whole thing. And they are very special. They've got their own day of creation. They are different from all the other animals. They are allowed to give names to all the other animals, and of course to rule over them. Indeed, that will become their mission. Now, we know this biblical idea because it has made big waves. It is still with us in our culture, and I would argue that it is with us in our culture much more deeply than most people realize. But before we pin everything on the Bible, we have to remember that this idea is actually much, much older. The idea that human beings are able to rule over the earth, that comes from Mesopotamia. That's the first time that we have any written sources dealing with this. And we can glimpse this in different things. For instance, there is a wonderful alabaster vase, the so-called Uruk vase, that was probably part of the temple of Uruk, and it shows a scene of sacrifice, and it shows in different bands, as it were, the hierarchy of living things, and it starts with the water and the plants of the water, and then you get the animals, and then you get the people, and then you get the temple with the gods above that. So we are in a very hierarchical world here, in a world where dominion mattered. And the Uruk vase is from 3200 BCE or so it is a good 5,000 years old. But Mesopotamian culture spanned millennia, and if we go to a much later incarnation of Mesopotamian culture, the so-called Neo-Babylonian Empire in the 7th century BCE, we see, well, very much the same if we go to, for instance, the big palace of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. Nineveh that is today in Mosul, so a very violent landscape. And already 3,000 years ago it was a very violent landscape, because the palace of the great king Ashurbanipal, who was so important because he was also the first king to have a large library, and much of what we know of Babylonian culture and literature comes from Ashurbanipal's library that was found with lots of clay tablets in it, thousands of them. But the rest of Ashurbanipal's palace is decorated with beautiful reliefs and beautiful decorations that show Ashurbanipal subduing animals, hunting lions, throttling lions with his bare hands, hunting lions with his spear, killing prisoners, humiliating enemies. So it is all about violence, and it is all about dominion, this world. And perhaps that is best expressed in the greatest hero of the Mesopotamian cultures, because there were several of them, but there was also a certain cultural continuity, and that hero is Gilgamesh. The Gilgamesh epos, also written down probably in the 3rd millennium before Christ, before the Common Era. The Gilgamesh epos was found in Ashurbanipal's library, and to the great shock of many people in the 19th century, when it was finally deciphered, it showed that the biblical stories were not original as people had thought, but that there were stories that were much older and predecessors, among them the story of Noah and the flood that already pops up in the Gilgamesh epos. But what really interests us is the great hero Gilgamesh himself, and Gilgamesh wants, in this tradition of violent kingship, of conquest and of possession, Gilgamesh wants to defeat death itself. First of all, he wants to gain fame, and he goes to the cedar forest and he kills the spirit of the cedar forest, and he chops down all the cedars to make temple doors. And so what he's really doing is he demystifies nature, and he makes it into an economic resource, something that we know fairly well. But then he goes out to defeat death itself and to become immortal, and he goes for great distances and braves all sorts of great dangers until he actually comes to the first last chance saloon in world history, the beer house by the edge of the water. And the woman who serves the beer at the beer house tries to dissuade Gilgamesh and gives him the advice to simply enjoy life and accept his death, but he cannot. And he goes on and he fails. And he has to come back to his own city, and as a mortal man as he went out. But standing on the walls of his city, Ur, he understands that his immortality is in the fact that he has built this city, and the city will outlive him. But also, if you stood on the top of the walls of a Mesopotamian city, you might very well have had the impression that you had dominated nature. Now, this is speculative history. It's strictly speaking not history, but speculation. But let's just speculate a little. Mesopotamian culture started to flourish and to become possible because the Mesopotamians mastered irrigation. And through irrigation channels, they could create 3 harvests a year sometimes. They could intensify their agriculture, and by intensifying their agriculture, of course, they could also sustain a larger population and a city population and diversified labor, etc. That was a very powerful way of creating culture. It also happened in the Indus Valley. It happened also in China around that time, and later it went to Southeast Asia and also to Mesoamerica. But when you stood on the city wall of one of these cities, you would have seen the orchards and the gardens with their walls around them and their beautiful flowers, and then you would have seen fields of different crops, and then you would have seen the pens for the animals, and then beyond all that you would have seen nature. You would have seen the wilderness as a vaguely hostile place that had not yet been conquered. So this is the world that the idea of dominating nature comes from. And now we get one of the most important agents in history, chance. It so happened that the Neo-Babylonian Empire had a dusty little colony by the banks of the Mediterranean. That colony, Judea, had a capital, Jerusalem, and it wasn't particularly important. It wasn't particularly wealthy. It didn't have a particularly rich culture. It was very much torn between the two superpowers of the day, ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. And when the king of Mesopotamia fought a war that went badly for him, the Judeans thought that this was the moment that they could gain their liberty, and they rebelled against their Neo-Babylonian master in order to go over to the side of the Egyptians. But that went rather badly for them, because Jerusalem was besieged by the Babylonians, and the temple was destroyed in 586 BCE, and that was the beginning of the legendary Jewish exile. Now, why is this so important? First of all, we know about it from literature, we know about it through the Bible, and it has become one of the great tragic events of Jewish history. Actually, it was anything but uncommon at the time, because in great empires such as the Babylonian one, it was quite normal policy to send people who had rebelled against the central power to far-flung corners of the empire in order to break the potential for rebellion in that province and pacify it. But the Jews found themselves, or the Judeans as they still were, at the sharp end of this policy, and they were transported to Babylonia. And there, perhaps also to retain their identity, to create a portable homeland. They wrote down their holy scriptures, they wrote down their holy stories and their myths and their laws. And these form the 5 books of Moses, as the Jews say, the Torah. Living in this new world, the Jews adopted much of what they found in their surroundings. They probably took over a lot of the stories. They also took over a lot of the laws that were already laid down much earlier in the Codex Hammurabi. And so we also see the appearance of the idea of dominating the earth. And it becomes part of Jewish scripture. Perhaps it's also a sort of rhetorical device, because the Jews were almost completely powerless at the time. So ruling over the whole earth must have been a great dream for them. And by the way, just a linguistic footnote, if you now say, but you misunderstand, the Bible doesn't say you should subjugate the earth or you should subdue it. The Bible effectively says you should be a good steward of the earth, a kind shepherd to natural resources. Then that is true for some parts of the Bible that also have a very different idea of humans and the natural environment. But certainly in this case, also the verb is always used for very brutal acts. It's used for conquest, for subjugation, even for rape. So it's definitely not a kind word. So subjugating the earth, that really meant what it said. Now, the Babylonian culture was basically dying at the time, was soon be taken over by the Persians, and after millennia, finally it would be extinguished. But now some important Babylonian ideas had made it into this holy scripture, and like in a time capsule, these ideas were transported into a region of the world that had never had any contact with them, and they arrived almost 1,000 years later, in late antiquity, in the Mediterranean basin and then in the rest of Europe. With the missionizing zeal of the Catholic Church. And so this idea from a completely different culture was suddenly planted into this world. Now, why is this important? Why should we be bothered about ancient history? I think it is important because it has set the way in which we still implicitly see the world. It has set the way in which, for instance, also the Enlightenment much later explains the world. It is still about dominating nature. Now it is science that is supposed to dominate nature, but it is still an idea, a consciousness that humans are above nature and outside of nature, and what they do has no consequence on nature. Human history just regards humans. You can see that very well in the philosophy of René Descartes, who wrote in the 17th century, a great philosopher, a very important early Enlightenment philosopher. And he makes the argument that only human beings share with the divine insofar as that they have a soul, and this soul is eternal. And the rest of nature is simply only material. It is not, as he puts this, a thinking matter, a res cogitans, but only an extended matter, res extensa. And therefore, animals do not feel anything. They have no rights, they have no desires, they have no memories, they have no personality, and indeed no sensations. They are simply biological robots. The amazing thing is that Descartes actually had a dog that he liked very much, Monsieur Gratte, so Mr. Scratch, and somehow he could live with this cognitive dissonance that on the one hand he had a dog he adored, and on the other hand he wrote that all animals are simply robots. But it creates the idea of human beings being sovereign over nature and being able and indeed allowed and perhaps even called upon to do with nature as they please, because nature does not have a voice, nature does not have an interest, nature does not have any intrinsic rights. You can still incidentally see this phenomenon in any supermarket, which is the only way where city dwellers encounter the natural world and its products. But supermarkets do not only bring us in touch with that, they're actually much more screens to screen us from the reality that we do not want to see. And they project all sorts of wonderful images thought up by marketing agencies of happy farmers and even happier animals and beautiful landscapes when you buy the products of industrial agriculture. So, the idea that humans are divorced from nature is something really fundamental in our culture. You can also see it in economics, where economic processes are only thought of in terms of raw materials and capital and machines and logistics, etc., but not in as far as how they are part of the natural environment in which all of this is produced, out of which all of this is taken, what that does with that in that natural environment. Let's make a little step here. It's not too big a step. The climate crisis suddenly forces humanity to understand that whatever humanity does not happen outside of nature. That humanity's enormous technological and economic progress has only been possible to be realized because nature was damaged and exploited, and that these depleted systems mean that the life support of humanity and indeed of other animals is equally depleted. And all of a sudden, we see that there's almost a sort of ring, a circle closing here, Because at the beginning of this podcast, I spoke about animism and about the idea that humans realized that whatever they did, they were treading on the territory of someone else. They had to find an arrangement with that force. And today, we learn that this intuition wasn't so wrong, that whatever humanity does in nature indeed touches other systems, touches other biosystems, touches a biosphere and changes parameters and therefore changes this biosphere. And that if we want to exist in this biosphere, we have to recognize that, just as ancient people did by doing offerings, by bringing offerings, we have to recognize that by, well, we don't need a new animism. We don't need the gods and goddesses back. We don't need to build temples. But the language of science can do the same today. It can make us realize how far we are entangled in natural systems, that we ourselves are a product of natural systems. This is a big ask, not at least psychologically, because for 3,000 years, this idea that humanity was above nature was phenomenally powerful, and it was, of course, from Europe, exported via colonialism and imperialism into the world. And how that was possible, by the way, I will explore in my next podcast, when we look at the role of chance in history and why Europe indeed did conquer the world. But Europe did, and for 3,000 years this was a phenomenally powerful idea that we are outside and above nature and can subdue it. Why has it become so suicidal, so sudden? I think the answer to that is simply to be found in the use of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels allowed us to decouple productivity from human muscle, or because for most of history, the work that could be done was based on human muscle, some animal muscle, and then a bit of wind and water. But with fossil fuels, with putting into the atmosphere organic matter from millions of years ago, this equation changed very dramatically. And, well, the surge in productivity has produced what we know as our modern world, but at the same time, this surge of productivity has created the collapse of natural systems. And this goes only back 60 years or so. So the fossil fuels really are a great caesura in this story. And we're beginning to see that much of what we regard today as problematic or even catastrophic in this world also has to do with the fact that we are operating 21st century technology effectively with the mindset that was formed in the Bronze Age. Now, human dominion over the world has not only become a nonsensical idea, I think it has become a profoundly dangerous idea. And the question is, are there any other ideas? We cannot go back to animism. Are there any other ideas of how we can conceptualize our relationship with nature? And I want to leave you with one suggestion that was made by the late French philosopher Bruno Latour, who said that we should effectively stop thinking of ourselves as living on the earth. And he didn't mean that we should be living on Mars. What he meant was that the image created by the idea that we're living on the earth gives us an idea of having our feet in the dirt and our heads high up in the air and overlooking the landscape. And that is a very dominating perspective. And he said perhaps we should start thinking that we're living inside the critical zone. And the critical zone, that is the thin membrane of gas that surrounds this planet. It's only, I think, a few kilometers thick. And within this thin membrane of gas, all life can happen. And this membrane is chemically actually very unstable because the gases that form it are produced by very different actors, billions of different actors, from microbes to plankton, and from tectonic plates to environmental legislation, and from jet stream winds to human consumption. All of that become the factors that make up this critical zone. And humanity has to find its place within this critical zone. It is not living on Earth, but it is living deeply entangled in this zone. This is a thought I find fascinating. This is an image I find fascinating. I'd be very keen to hear what you think about this. Write me a comment. I will answer if I get your comments. Like this podcast and recommend it to your friends. Tell them about it. And if you're not of my opinion, be sure to write and object. And if you think this is just fantastic, then do praise it and like it. I'm looking forward to being in touch with you, to get new ideas for new episodes, and to continue this dialogue. For today, I say goodbye and good listening.